the digital first component of that is probably an increasingly important part of your marketing strategy and has to be the focus of your marketing strategy.
Okay, but the insurgent marketer, right? So, in terms of how do you get cut through in this environment is really, I think your advice is good, is to start with your consumer, start with your customer and work back from that. Hello, Rondo, and happy 2025 to you. We're going to kick off today the insurgent mindset to talk about media. I'm Matt Tice.
Hey, Matt, it's Rondo Moses from New York City. Looking forward to the conversation.
So, Rondo, why media? It's a wide-ranging topic. We're going to have a look at a little bit about, how media has been disrupted, where it's heading, and importantly, what are the implications for the insurgent mindset. But why did we pick this topic?
For me, it was, I thought, given that the media was sort of at the center of a lot of the political space over the last year and a half, 2 years, I thought it'd be an interesting topic to talk about, especially since the industry is really in a state, I would say, of disruption and reinvention. Whether you're looking at the cable news networks trying to navigate declining viewership or social media platforms really challenging the status quo broadcasters in the industry, there's a lot of change happening in the media industry.
Okay, so it's fair to say, however, that this change has been almost a 20-year slow train wreck for media, at least
Absolutely.
traditional legacy media. Certainly, let's probably set the table here by declaring that the internet is what drove this change to start with, and now we're seeing all the collateral impacts of the internet and really the new media models that have sort of come out of that. But it feels like we made a shift where that slow moving change is really starting to accelerate. Is that fair?
I think that's fair. I think that's definitely fair. And I think the pandemic helped to accelerate that as well. People really sort of focus more on their digital needs and the ability to personalize content that they received during the pandemic. So I think it really drove that as well.
Okay. Well, maybe it'd be useful just to start with kind of a bit of an overview of what is changing in media, and let's try to unpack some of the drivers of that change and really get a sense of how is it different from what it used to be, what's its direction of travel, and perhaps what are some of the lessons for leaders. And then maybe we can talk to continue our series on some of the case studies that are, kind of exemplifying these challenges. Perhaps we can dig into a few of those. So,
Mhm.
Rondo, I'll ask you to start by kind of giving us a 100,000-foot overview of what's driving change in media.
If I look at media from through the lens of broadcasting television, I think a big part of what's driving it is declining viewership. Um, and the declining viewership coupled with a shift to a younger demographic who, for example, is really very keen on cutting the cable cord. Those of us of a certain age who were more reliant on cable, the younger generation is not. So I think because of that declining viewership, when you're looking at it from that broadcasting perspective, that's been driving the disruption in the industry and a lot of revenue pressure because of that declining viewership. Advertisers have been following the money and they've been following the viewers over to social media because from their perspective, social media allows them an opportunity to really target the audiences better that they're trying to reach on those platforms than in traditional media. So that I think that's another big issue. I think a third one is just the challenge of misinformation and disinformation. I think a lot of folks who typically would be supporters of traditional media feel that they can't trust the sources of information. They also look at it and say, has it really evolved from news to just pure entertainment? And so I think that misinformation, disinformation has been another challenge as well.
Okay. All right, so maybe I could just add a few thoughts to that. I think first, let's go all the way back to the rise of the internet. I think if we look at media, and I suppose there's a whole ecosystem of media, and this has probably affected every part of that ecosystem, from news media to entertainment to print media to academic journals. Really across the whole media ecosystem has been affected. And then in the meantime, we've had significant new media come into that, particularly things like gaming, where we're talking about hundreds of billions of dollars of investment into these alternative media sources, which have become quite material, and obviously social media. We'll come back to that a little bit later. But if you think about the disruption of media, it's been largely completely across the full value chain, from every aspect of content creation, which we used to be very closed and very curated. Now that's quite democratic in its form, where a lot of the content is not only free, but people on the street are providing both entertainment and news and gaming and other content,
Hmm.
which plays a key role, often for free, but not always. There's a lot of conversation to be had there too. Of course, digital distribution and mobile has played a key role in terms of how that's if you unpack that, you can just see that distribution's very different. And distribution and advertising are obviously quite inextricably linked, in a sense that advertisers want to go where the people are.
Right.
So that sort of shift, and probably is, in my mind, where the money goes, gives us the biggest clue about what's disrupting that industry. And of course, the kind of traditional linear media is getting less of that advertising, and it's going towards more new media or alternative media, which has changed significantly how the power balance sort of shows up in both in terms of firms, but also in terms of where people are publishing and why. So that's, I
Hmm.
think, a key factor, and we can talk about some of the case studies in a minute. Um, so that's the advertising, but then consumption has changed as well. As we sort of keep working through the value chain, your point about the youth or the demographic shift is partly because different demographic strata consume media in very different ways,
Very different
right?
ways.
And
Yeah.
of course, these are all collateral impacts of this digital revolution that we've had in this last sort of 2 decades. But if we sort of again zoom back for a second and just sort of look at how that all shifts, how all these shifts sort of impact the economics of media, fundamentally the old co-players, the ones like that you mentioned, legacy media, so cable, that's in decline, no doubt
Hmm.
about that. Mainstream news, print publication, steep decline. Although some of the niche papers are holding their own. One of my favorites, The Economist, has been really still quite robust.
Right.
And sort of the disappearance, if you will, of rural and local media, um, big problem. And then perhaps also the massive consolidation of media power, as the industries try to deal with this. Relatively few big players have hoovered up all of or most of the value add in advertising in particular, but also in content distribution, which has
Hmm.
created a completely new dynamic. Very interesting.
Yeah, I think though, your point about publishing, for example, I think that there are some players in the publishing on the publishing side, the newspaper side, I should say, who, struggled a lot in the beginning with all of the change, but have adapted pretty well. I think about the New York Times, for example. They've done very well on the digital side, as well as the Washington Post. So there are some incumbent players that struggled in the beginning to make the shift, but recognized that they needed to make it and have been making the investment to make them more digital first than they have been in the past. So I think that that's positive. But then there are, like I said, the cable broadcasters, for example, are continuing to struggle. There's expectation that there's going to be a lot of shakeup and a lot more changes coming down the road for a lot of these cable companies because they are still reliant on that old traditional model and really focused on the older, I would say, audience base as opposed to the younger audience base who have different needs and expectation and want to control more of the content coming at them, and they want to focus on the creator So I think that that's an ever evolving space that's we're going to see a lot more change.
All right, well, let's start there. Let's talk about cable, right? So, uh, cable is clearly in decline. I don't know. I probably it's been 5 or 7 years since I cut the cord from cable,
Me
right?
too.
So
Me too.
it's and from my own experience, cable is completely irrelevant. Um, but I did some research just in the lead up to the podcast, looking at the Australia media landscape. Free to air is actually still quite resilient in Australia,
Hmm.
certainly for the older demographic, but
Yes.
slightly ahead, just very slightly ahead of of new media in particularly in content distribution, slightly ahead of cable and slightly ahead of platform distribution like Netflix and others. So, I thought that was a big surprise. It's obviously going to change because the growth rates of, platform media are much higher than free to air, which is in decline. So those will cross over very shortly. But I thought it was interesting to your point.
Mhm.
Some of these parts of the ecosystem have been quite resilient. But cable, yeah, I can't see cable persisting. So if we're in an environment where, cable will not look the same as it used to.
What do you think's driving that sort of difference between the rate of acceleration of the decline of cable in the U.S. versus in Australia? What do you think it's just a demographic difference that's causing that? Like what do you think's driving that?
Well, part of it is there's a lot of loyalty to the Australian media landscape, our big networks. Second is that free to air, at least free to air digital, is mandatory. So all, these providers have to continue to provide that by law,
Mm,
have to continue to provide that content free to air. So that option exists, although there are, they do have apps and they do have other mechanisms of digital distribution, but um, free to air also is required in terms of reception. So smart TVs here have to have free to air capability, for
there's
example.
some of regulatory requirements around that.
At some level, there has been some protection there, without getting into the detail. So there's that factor. But from a demographic point of view, the free to air does skew towards the older generation, certainly. Um,
Hmm.
and of course, remote rural plays a role there too, where perhaps internet isn't quite as reliable, or the speeds aren't quite as high. So, it does play a role in the landscape here.
Yeah, and I also think here in the US, the lack of trust of the information, traditional information sources, and the need for people, to your point, to want to create content on their own,
Hmm.
sort of creates a platform for where people can set up on YouTube and create their own audiences, because there are people searching for other perspectives on the news, and people that they trust more on social media than they trust, on the traditional news outlets. So I think that that's driving it too. In addition, you have a lot of folks who have become creators on platforms like YouTube, and they can use TikTok, etc., to create opportunities for themselves, and that's driving a lot of focus from the young audiences as well, because they're not only consumers of that information, they're also content creators, and they see themselves as content creators. So I think that's a
So,
big driver too.
all right. So, if we sort of stay with that for a minute in the content domain. So in the old days, content would largely be served up to us, right? Whether that be through print or through traditional linear media, television, for example. But now the shift is that content is much more democratic. So individuals are taking, well, I don't say taking responsibility, but for example, influencers in some cases are getting tens of millions of dollars a year of advertising revenue to share content to their niche audiences, whatever they may be. It could be fashion, or it could be news, although not so much in the news domain.
Hmm.
Although, well, I don't know. A Joe Rogan, for example, might be a good example
Right.
where, is it news? I'm not sure, but news entertainment at least
It's
playing a role.
information. It's
It
information.
is information. Yep.
Yeah.
And I think, that sort of democratization of content has created a lot of new opportunities, but has really challenged the mainstream media companies in a sense that I guess the historical business model of publications and particularly of news, but also entertainment content, has been um, built around, for example, in news, journalistic integrity, which then requires big editorial teams, then requires journalists on the beat, on the ground. And to your point, the trust in that sort of whole model has been undermined significantly, where particularly the younger demographic seems to prefer the voice of their peers and their own echo chambers over what we might describe as traditional trusted media sources. So that's a big challenge, and I think that's sort of shown up in recent elections around the world, for example, politically, but again, sort of accelerating the decline of these traditional media sources. And of course, not surprisingly, traditionally, as these industries are disrupted, the marquee brands are the last to go. Washington
Yeah.
Post, New York Times, the Australian Financial Review, The Economist. They're the Harvards and the Oxfords of media. So it's the middle and the bottom that have really been hollowed out. And I suppose I did some research again just to look at how many journalists in Australia 20 years ago, 10 years ago, and today. I couldn't get the number, but I was able to see that between 2010 and 2005 and 2015, there were roughly 3 to 5 thousand journalists that were sacked out of traditional media, and that number has
Hmm.
doubled again in the last decade. So we have almost 10,000 fewer journalists in Australia than we did 2 decades ago.
In traditional media, or are you saying journalists overall?
In traditional media,
In
right?
traditional media, right.
Yep. So
Because what we're seeing here in the US is that, maybe they're shrinking from the traditional outlets, but they're a lot more independent journalists, which is why platforms like YouTube, et cetera, have become so powerful because now they can go and create their own audience bases on these platforms.
sure. I think the big question there is what is a journalist? And
Yeah.
from a point of view of how you grade the content, right? So you mentioned earlier about um, is the content reliable? Um, for example, in the news domain, are there, are facts up for debate, for example?
Hmm.
In the old business model, journalistic integrity was highly valued, and whether
It
or
was a
not you
non-negotiable.
it was non-negotiable. Whether or not you believe those were facts, I'm sure there's always going to be bias in a system, but that has largely gone away, and the kind of I suppose the democratization has also relied on the consumer of the information. And again, it doesn't matter if it's news or entertainment or other things. The consumer of the of the media to
Hmm.
judge the quality and the rigor of that content,
Hmm.
which is a big shift in a sense that the consumer never really had to worry about that before, and now the consumer has to either put zero energy into it, in which case they're highly vulnerable to you know I guess terrible information, and then or put a lot of energy into it, in which case then the consumer becomes part of that value creation process. I think it's very interesting.
I think the other bone of contention that people have is that, what used to be traditional news has really morphed more into just pure entertainment. The focus is on, clicks and eyeballs and less on, to your point, the quality of the information and facts. And I think that has turned even some traditional viewers off. And I think it's also a reason why younger audiences don't like to watch it because they don't see the value. And that's why they look for other sources of information who they feel they can trust than the traditional sources of media.
Certainly. Okay. Well, that's a fair point. And so it's a very confusing, complex situation, right?
Yeah.
Meanwhile, we've got some some change in terms of where the money's flowing. Okay, so the old models were very much reliant heavily on advertising, and that's still a factor, obviously. We haven't really talked about social media yet, but certainly the duopoly almost of Meta and Google hoover up a lot of the world's advertising revenue.
Right.
There's no doubt about that. But the pay-per-view model, which was actually originally developed by cable, has now morphed in that sort of pay-per-content or pay-per-unit of information in through paywalls in digital distribution has played a key role. And of course, the subscription model has again, more or less invented by newspapers, but that subscription model then is pervasive in content distribution now, especially for entertainment, but also for news, mixed media, et cetera. So that also has played a role. Are there other elements of the model? Where's the money flowing that you can think of, Rondo, that are quite relevant?
Hmm. I think that those, for me, those are the big ones. No, I can't think of anything else.
Okay. So then what does it mean for our audience, which is typically the C-suite, particularly marketers who are looking to place advertising? Where would this is a very complex environment. How do you navigate all this change, and how do you sort of bring this insight into making better decisions for your enterprise?
I think it gets back to as a marketer, trying to figure out where's your audience.
Mm,
So if you have a young demographic, or if you see that, your audience is, to your earlier point, very mobile centric, they are into social media, then you really need to be on these social media platforms so that a digital first approach needs to be the way that you're thinking about your marketing strategy, in addition to maintaining or, balancing that with your traditional marketing efforts. You really need to think about the balance of how you're allocating those resources. And I would say that the digital first component of that is probably an increasingly important part of your marketing strategy and has to be the focus of your marketing strategy.
okay. But the insurgent marketer, right? So, in terms of how do you get cut through in this environment is really, I think your advice is good, is to start with your consumer, start with your customer and work back from that.
Yeah,
But I think it's also about understanding that, some of your competition is still, skewed towards traditional legacy media, linear
right.
media, whatever that might be, and finding ways to meaningfully activate that audience in very different disruptive ways is, I think, a really interesting opportunity. One thing you mentioned earlier that struck a note with me, which I think is fascinating, is the degree to which marketing or the enterprise mindset is needing to be more or less political in this environment. So,
Mm,
for example, I think we saw there was a cartoon. I can't remember the guy's name in the that was just I can't believe I can't remember his name, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The Washington Post, one of the cartoonists from the Washington Post had put together a cartoon sort of showing the different business leaders genuflecting to Donald Trump, a statue of
mhm.
Donald Trump, and included Mickey Mouse as well. And I think it's a fascinating dynamic to see whether or not um, a corporation can remain aloof from emerging populist politics, or whether they have to declare allegiance to one side or the other. Can they hedge? Can they not? This is something
Yeah,
that I think has probably been a really distant 10th or 11th thing that marketers and public relations parts of enterprises have had to think about. But now it's almost number one. Are we on the fence? Are we red, blue, or are we conservative, liberal? Are we labor, liberal, whatever jurisdiction you're in? It doesn't really matter. But this is now something that C-suite executives really have to engage with and make choices about.
right. And I think for most of them, it's how do they not step into that political landmine? That's what they're trying to manage, right? It's sort of like how do we not um, step into that because it's probably not going to end well for them. The challenge is that either it's the consumer or employees may try to pull them in, but how do they uh, address that in a nonpartisan way? I think would be the safest bet for them when dealing with those issues.
My question is, can you hedge, right? So we've seen through, for example, with the Me Too movement, Colin Kaepernick with Nike.
Right.
Over the last decade, it's been very interesting to see these firms experiment with Gillette, experiment with this sort of overt declaration, red, blue, whatever. And there's been significant backlash to these strategies in some cases. And in other cases, some firms have gone all in to cater to a particular audience. I think about, for example, Black Rifle Coffee, where a firm like that is declared red. They're going to be red. They're going to compete by serving the conservative audience and make no apologies about that. I just think it's
Mhm.
interesting that you have to make these choices. And as the political winds sort of ebb and flow, is it purple? Is it blue? Is it red? Whatever. Um, Also, firms seem to be ebbing and flowing as well. It's very different than what we saw maybe a decade ago.
Yeah, a great example of that, I think, to now is with what's happening with DEI programs.
Hmm.
So you see a lot of companies sort of proactively disbanding their DEI programs in anticipation of the new administration in the United States. Um,
Right, not quietly either. They're actually out there saying
they're
it's in.
out there
Yes,
saying it, right?
right.
And in
Yep.
some cases, that probably works well with some of the electorate, but in other cases, it doesn't because I do know that there are a lot of let's say, people of color who are looking at the list of companies that have made that declaration, like Walmart and McDonald's, for example, just as two examples that come top of mind, and they're saying, why should we give them our money? Why
Mm.
should we be supporting organizations? And for companies that have stood up and said no, like Costco, they're saying that's the kind of company we should be supporting. So I think it's a tough case. Now, Costco came out because it didn't want to, it was feeling pressure to do the same as the others. And they immediately came out and said, no, we're going to stick with our DEI program.
Interesting. I think there's another parallel, interesting sort of thing to think about with obviously the announcement of Meta pulling back on its fact checking,
Mm,
or pulling back is probably underemphasizing the point, which is basically disbanding the fact.
disbanding it.
Now,
Yes.
part of that seems to be a competitive response to X, formerly Twitter, which has already made that move. But, that's again a very visible shift in terms of a company that probably would have skewed traditionally blue to, much more neutral or probably slightly to the right now, which is interesting. But I think for corporations, the thing that I think is interesting now is a question that comes to my mind is, will companies now be held to the same standard of reliable information as has been expected historically? So, for example,
Mm,
with consumer information or product attributes and characteristics or quality or whatever it might be, we've always held corporations to a certain standard in terms of the information that they provide to their constituents, really across the board, everything from financial information to consumer information and everything in between that. I wonder in this world where facts are starting to drift, whether or not that scrutiny will then be required of corporations or at least not enforced, and to what degree will that create, I suppose, opportunities for bad actors to
mhm,
exploit that gap,
mhm.
or a loosening, if you will, which then provides good actors opportunities to play on the margins, create new opportunities, and things like that. I wonder. What do you think?
I think your point about the enforcement is the key.
Hmm.
So, I'm not sure what this new administration's plans are, but if the expectation is that we want to be more business friendly, and in that regard, we will pull back on enforcement of making sure that companies are providing accurate information to consumers, or if they take teeth out of the consumer protection agency, then you have your answer right there, right? Because then companies can say whatever they want to say for marketing purposes, but have no real factual basis behind them. That's going to be a challenge. But again, if there's no enforcement, it doesn't really matter. So we as consumers can be outraged, but if the powers that be are not going to really enforce it, it's not going to have a lot of teeth. So consumers are outraged, but the administration is sort of looking the other way in those instances, and you're just going to get other companies that are going to follow suit.
Hmm. Yep.
And
All right.
I think that that's a clear risk.
It is a clear risk, but also an opportunity, I think, for companies to either take the high ground and sort of emphasize that high ground that
Hmm.
we are good actors and that we do provide factual information, for example, to consumers or whatever. So I think there's an opportunity for differentiation there somewhere. Um,
Hmm.
I think there is an opportunity to exploit some of that, and many firms will take advantage of that as well. And whether that be on the margin or in particular areas, but I think in your marketing strategy, I'd be thinking about that, right? Can we take advantage of this in a meaningful way within the boundaries of the law, of course? So I think that there is a factor there. I'm
But
not
I think also
recommending that,
no, no,
Rondo.
no. But
Wrong,
I
but
also
it
think
will
part of
happen.
that decision comes down to, what is your organization's core values?
Of course.
So if you take that position, how does that communicate, or what does that communicate, excuse me, to your employees, to consumers about what this organization stands for?
Well,
So,
okay. Let's go back to Meta though. So, I think, the message to me from the decision that Meta made about this, fact-checking engine that they have inside their companies is that those values are not immutable in many firms. So again,
right.
this is a choice that has to be made. Do we try to align with the prevailing winds of change in society, or do we hew to a fixed view of what our values are? Again, I don't have a view on this, but I think it's the kind of thing that the C-suite needs to engage on is a review in this environment where all this social change is obviously affecting consumers. To what degree do those values hold true? I think it's a useful time to step back and revisit that in light of all this change. I think it's really important because the
And
media maelstrom is obviously playing a role in influencing consumers in different directions than previously.
But what's on my mind is what really was the main driver of that decision? Is it really because consumers want that, or is it because there's a sense that the new administration prefers that? And so, because from a consumer point of view, I've heard, this is anecdotal, of course, lots of folks in my network saying, hey, if it wasn't for Facebook, that I like Facebook because it keeps me connected to family and friends, old friends, I would untether from Facebook just like I've done from X.
Hmm.
So I think that he, Meta has not felt the impact yet because people are still evaluating it. But there could be a time where Meta, loses subscribers just like X has lost subscribers.
Well, another example, at least in traditional media, is the Washington Post lost something like 250,000 subscribers
Absolutely.
following their decision not to endorse one candidate or another. So that was
Right.
direct and immediate, right?
Right.
So I'm sure it'll take a little while for us to see the Facebook stats, but there will be but the reason in my mind doesn't really matter. It's really a question of, there's like a flywheel or a vicious cycle here where um, because the societal has made some shift, whether it's a big one
Hmm.
or not, we could debate. That affects consumers, and then some consumers will push back, some consumers will embrace that. That's really a question of segmentation and marketing, right? In terms of who we're going to draw, how we're going to engage with our audience, that plays a
Yeah.
role. But
Yep.
I think your point's so important about the values is how do we filter those decisions? And for
Mm.
example, I'd say in both of these situations where um, the Washington Post and the Meta stated values um, are perhaps not well aligned with these decisions, right?
Right.
So
Right.
then that creates a lack of authenticity, which then shows up in how they engage with consumers. And these are the kinds of challenges that I think that modern marketers have to deal with. Um, so I think that's really quite interesting. We only have a few minutes left. I think it'd be useful to kind of, sum up and talk a little bit about, what are some of the lessons that the insurgent, or at least the insurgent mindset lessons that um, in this way of thinking, um, how do we capture all this confusion and bring it to sort of a bit of a head? I'll start. There's a few things that sort of jump to mind that sort of come out of this conversation. So in reverse order, I think really understanding the degree to which those values align to all this change is really important. And I think there's um, a lot of benefit to step back and have a hard look at that. I think obviously if you're in the media industry and you're not really prioritizing thinking deeply about your business model and the degree to which that business model continues to be relevant, you're behind the curve because it is
Mhm.
changing very quickly. We haven't really talked about AI, but I think we're going to go into another gear as AI plays a key role in both in content generation and in driving distribution and in segmentation and consumption at some level too, as people and machines start to work more closely together. So I think that invites a lot of opportunity for scrutiny as well. And something
Yeah.
you said right at the beginning, start with the customer and work back, I think to me is almost the key lesson, right?
Yeah.
Is really in this environment, understanding that sort of consumer change, sentiment, how consumers are also engaging with these issues, and then use that as a filter to help you understand your overt or otherwise declaration of how you're going to navigate the politics and the other issues that we've sort of discussed here. And I think third, related to that is now the opportunity with AI and emerging technology to be much more granular and personalizing that experience for people. I think there's a lot of opportunities to invest there. And I think we're still early days in terms of really bringing that to life. Those would be my few.
That's a great point, Matt. I just would extend that a bit and say that leaders, regardless of their industry, should be thinking about, are they focusing on customers first and optimizing what they do for customers? Are they thinking about the relevance of their business model to the ever-evolving environment? And if that business model is no longer, serving them well, are they making the investments now to ensure that they are able to stay competitive going forward? So I think that's really the big thing here is how do leaders, regardless of these industries, really think more like these insurgents who are agile, who are constantly innovating and looking for ways to reach customers and not just the existing customers, but new customers.
Okay, great. Well, I think it'd be useful for us to come back to this topic perhaps at a later date and explore a little bit the media ecosystem, particularly from a point of view of how the power shift has kind of manifested in the skew towards platform companies and away from traditional media, the hybridization of these. I think there's a really interesting conversation to be had, sort of about, the consolidation of this industry and again, what it means in terms of how you navigate these forces. So perhaps we can come back to that again later. But in the meantime, thank you, Rondo. It's always a pleasure. And
Likewise, Matt, I look forward to continuing the conversation.
perfect. Have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to seeing you soon.
Great. Bye-bye.